So, since you do have dual citizenship, did you react culturally to the situation in Mexico from a Mexican perspective or an American perspective? As in, was it hard for you to feel like your home country was going through what it's going through now? Or was it more of an objective point of view from a neighboring country?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that you know, I have family and I have friends in Mexico, and I have deep ties to the country, and so I do react. I am aware of things unfolding in Mexico in a way that's personal. I also don't believe in kind of traditional objectivity. I mean, I think that all, whether it's Al Jazeera or Fox or CNN or any of the kind of news outlets, they're all framed within a particular perspective, even if they're going to great lengths to create equivalency. Sometimes it's a false equivalency, and so I don't necessarily think that there's a way to create this kind of utopic objectivity. But I definitely had a personal connection to the story. But in some ways, my kind of insider-outsider status was useful. So useful that I'm fluent in Spanish, useful that I have an understanding of the Mexican cultural and political context, but also useful that I live and work in New York, because when I first arrived in Tijuana, I was very much seen as an outsider, as I should have been, because I don't live in the city. And so I think in some ways that opened a lot of doors for me, coming from the U.S., being a part of a U.S. production company that I'd started, having funders and supporters that come from the United States. I was seen as someone who didn't have a local grievance or part of a local interest group. So as an international filmmaker, I was seen as someone who would take the story to an international level. And I also think that as filmmakers, we sometimes can use our outsiderness, our naivete, as a way to kind of draw people out. You're able to ask questions that maybe a local reporter wouldn't be able to ask. You can sit down with someone and say, well, I hadn't heard about that corruption scandal. I'm sorry, I don't know anything about it. Can you tell me about that story? Because I don't understand it. And people tend to be more willing to tell those stories to people who are not immediately a part of their community. So I think in this particular case, it was useful to be both, of this country, but at the same time, to have an international presence as well.
So one of the you wanted to create a larger context. What specific context did you have in mind when you set out to create this film?
I think the big piece was 2008, 2009, 2010. There was a lot of coverage, heavy coverage of the narco violence, of the violence itself, but with no historical context and very little focus on the kind of human stories, and so how people's ordinary lives were being affected by this violence. So there's a lot of kind of rubbernecking journalism. And what I hoped that Reportero could do, I mean, it was one of the things that I was just hoping to see myself, was to set up a kind of historical context for the current wave of violence against journalists. And one of the things that we were able to do in the film is to show how, even basically in the last 2 or 3 administrations, there has been violence against journalists, and that the real problem in Mexico has to do with impunity. So we were able to set up a kind of historical context, and history is a very unsexy thing. Cable news outlets love to do stand-ups in front of a massacre site where people loved. Anderson Cooper was doing stand-ups in El Paso about the violence in Juarez with dramatic lighting and these like very expensive graphics packages, and it's all very immediate. It's very dehistoricized. And not that every film has to be this ponderous, film about history, but in this particular case, I felt like it was really important to just build out some of the history, show how this is part of an ongoing problem, that the current situation is really linked to this other history. And then also to say that, also to look at the way that human lives are, the way that local residents have been affected by these stories. And that was part of why I focused on Sergio as a journalist as well, because he was someone who's always after the kind of story behind the story, the human stories, the kind of human texture, not just these, not just the beheadings and the body count, but who are the people who are being affected